With set 8 coming to a close, and with set 9 right around the corner, I've been looking back and reflecting on Hero Augments. I've already made a video on the best and worst Hero Augments, but the second thing that came to mind was whether or not Hero Augments as a whole were a good addition to TFT. So in this video, I'll go through some of the good and bad that came with Hero Augments and judge whether this new mechanic was good or not. Firstly, Hero Augments had a lot of depth to them, as there were 118 unique Hero Augments. Comparatively, set 7 at most had 12 dragons. So it was almost impossible to experience all the Hero Augments and all their variations. Even if you take the same Hero Augment, your board can be wildly different with other Augments, itemizations, and opponents in your lobby. So each game you play can feel like a unique experience. Theoretically, Hero Augments can never get old, as you can replace units and their augments to keep the mechanic fresh overall. But if there aren't enough units rotated out, then the mechanic will start to become dull. That is why the mid-set glitched out felt a bit boring, as it didn't replace that many units and change that many Hero Augments. Anyway, in 13.3, Hero Augments were given 4 dedicated rerolls, so you could roll and see up to 15 unique Hero Augments per game. So as a player, you had a lot of agency over this mechanic, and it felt great being able to control such an important part of your board, which subsequently also gave a lot of weight to your decisions. These dedicated rerolls relieved a burden, and Hero Augments no longer potentially sabotaged your later augment options. And there were many Hero Augments that achieved the goal behind their design: bring interesting, unique and transformative ways to play different champions in different roles. And of course this is very subjective, but there were augments like Time Knife, Rock Solid and Reign of Anger that transform their respective units into a damage carry with a change that may seem small but pairs extremely well with that unit's ability, items and comps. Although there definitely were Hero Augments that turned out to be very linear and bland, as they were just damage boosts, or the unit themselves were a tad underwhelming, and so the augment wasn't very transformative at all. And Hero Augments still had an issue that dragons also had, which is compositional variety. While Hero Augments weren't nearly as limiting as dragons, there would be a single most effective comp that players would play with each Hero Augment, so they were functionally just as limiting. Comp restrictions are a sort of necessary evil in TFT. There needs to be restrictions to each player's compositions to force skill expression and to prevent players from hard forcing comps. But the main issue here is that you can be put into positions where you just can't play around what you've hit, and being creative just isn't usually as effective as pursuing the meta composition. So while they did transform some units, Hero Augments did not transform comps as much as they could have, but I think that was more of a balance issue. Now, across set 8, players hated Hero Augments at 2-1, as there were numerous cases of not being in a good spot for any of the choices. The variance is extremely high, especially at 2-1, where you have the least amount of information, and now you'll make the most important decision in your game and pick your Hero Augment. And since these tend to be for 1 and 2 cost units, the pool is massive and you can use all of your rolls and not find any unit you're looking for. 4 rerolls was not enough agency over the mechanic at this point of the game. Of course, there needed to be Hero Augments at 2-1, as there were not any other opportunities to get Hero Augments for 1 cost units. But decisions, and especially augments at 2-1, should not dictate how you should play the rest of the game. That is incredibly dull, leaves very little room for creativity, and causes there to be issues with flexibility that many players struggle to dynamically play and adapt around what little options they have. Generally, Hero Augments get compared very frequently to the chosen mechanic back in set 4, where a unit could appear in your shop that, when purchased, was 2-starred and counted twice towards a certain trait. But Chosen was far better than Hero Augments in the sense that you could sell your chosen unit at any point in the game and roll to find a different chosen unit that may have been more suitable to the current state of your board. Hero Augments do not have this adaptability in any shape or form. In fact, augments are like this in general, where once you've picked your augment, there is nothing you can do to amend or change that choice in the future. This is a massive limitation and a source of frustration for many players because they simply cannot pivot into any other comps, because if they did, they'd be at least one augment down, which is a tremendous drawback in the current state of TFT. Honestly, if there was a way to amend Augment Selections in later stages of the game, TFT would become much less frustrating and much more amenable, which is just great for players. And this would alleviate the pain that is a 2-1 Augment Selection for a lot of players, even if it was a Hero Augment Selection or an ordinary one. So despite 2-1 Hero Augments being the most transformative and impactful augments, they can be really bad because if you miss, you're already in a terrible spot before the game has even begun. Deciding your late game board state at 2-1 is an impossible decision. Now, of course, Hero Augments shouldn't grant the same amount of power to units of different costs. For a 1-cost unit to be a viable carry late game, they need a lot more power than a 5-cost would. So understandably, the Hero Augments for lower cost units give a lot more power than they would for more expensive units. These powerful low cost carries still need to contend against more expensive carries late game, whereas there's nothing to keep 5-cost carries in check. But despite that, I think there was certainly a discrepancy between Hero Augments of the same cost, and these augments did not grant an equal amount of power. Those Hero Augments that fit in meta comps are always going to be stronger than out of meta Hero Augments and comps. And with the 4 rerolls, players can force meta comps by avoiding the weaker augments and picking the stronger ones. This significantly reduces the depth to Hero Augments, as the pool of viable augments is much smaller than it initially appeared. Hero Augments caused a lot of players to just use all of their rerolls looking for those specific units that were overtuned and overperforming, which means that a lot of players are contesting the same pool of units to either play the same comp or counter comps. This mostly boils down to a balancing issue. Not only do all the individual units and comps need to be balanced, but also every single one of the Hero Augments to keep players' options open. But 118 augments are just far too many to realistically balance in a reasonable time. Of course, there's normal balance with the power in the Hero Augment, but there's also balance of the comp flexibility as well. For example, Kale's Divine Ascent can only be played with Duelist because Underground gives Kale no power. On the other hand, Hyperbolic Time Chamber had numerous possibilities you could play around. And not knowing when your Hero Augment selection will occur, if at all, is a massive detriment and a hassle because it can be much more difficult to strategize due to your lack of information. But ultimately, the issue is balance. If you're forced to select a bad Hero Augment, you may just get buried by players who selected the stronger ones. If all the creative and difficult to play augments were just as strong as the meta ones, then this mechanic would have been well received by players across the board. Now, this may seem obvious for me to say, but Hero Augments replaced one normal augment selection, and this brought both good and bad consequences. In previous sets, all 3 augment selections could scale off each other really well and be really powerful. In some cases, the scaling was obscene and some augment combinations were very dominant, like getting triple cybernetic augments or triple trait related augments. So removing one normal augment choice greatly reduces the potential of some augment combinations, which is good for balance but potentially bad for fun. However, Hero Augments are unmarked in a sense. Players have become accustomed to silver, gold and prismatic augments, but Hero Augments didn't follow player expectations because they weren't labelled in the same way players are used to, and they greatly varied in power for different types of units at different costs. The power and opportunities that we've learned to expect as part of the game pace these last few sets was thrown off, and a lot of the Hero Augments don't match the power provided from regular augments. If you pair this varying power with the varying state of each player's board, it's very difficult to perceive how much each board has spiked in power. So now your expectation of how much ahead or behind players were has been completely thrown off by the Hero Augments, and the player that was last place and bleeding out suddenly hit Exodia and is now sending your unit to the Shadow Realm. So Hero Augments brought a tempo to the game that was really hard to understand and match because the rhythm was vastly different from player to player. Also, some of the augment offerings and distributions were really odd. For example, what was the point of 4-5-5 existing? 99% of the time, it's better to take the 5-cost Hero Augments because it gives you a 5-cost. The power behind the 4-cost Hero Augment just isn't even remotely comparable to offset that, even if your carry is a 4-cost unit. The pool for 5 costs is very small, so it's way easier to hit an ideal 5 cost unit and give your board a humongous spike in power. The 4 cost pool is larger, so you can just miss the carry augment you're looking for even if you use all of your rolls. And the gimmick with hero augments upgrading themselves feels unnecessary, and it's something you can't really account for as a player. Anyway, hero augments made units a lot more accessible by directly giving you the unit, and this was bad as it essentially ignored the shop and its odds. Being able to circumvent the need to roll and hit a specific unit was a very powerful tool, especially when it came to forcing meta units or comps. I get that having an augment for a unit you don't have is a stupid concept, but RNG was holding a lot of players back from being able to force comps. But with hero augments you now had a workaround. Basically, being able to hit your ideal unit, especially with 4 rerolls, was too powerful of a tool in players' hands as they could easily manipulate the mechanic. A lot of problems could have been resolved if the game told you when the hero augment selection was happening and what costs the augments were for. This could also at least bring some meaning to the upgrade mechanic, as you could then consider if those augments would also upgrade. However, I still find the lack of accurate information to be annoying, and I still think this mechanic would serve no purpose whatsoever. There's probably loads of arguments I missed in this video. Hero augments have been an interesting mechanic that has been widely discussed by the community, but I feel as though they were generally disliked. But good lessons were definitely learned from them. For example, trait-specific and hero augments have shown that getting locked into a specific unit or trait can feel horrible, especially when it's contested, and being unable to alter or amend this can just be painful. I really hope that in the future there's a way to amend your previous augment selections, especially as augments continue to be in TFT. Also, hero augments showed a problem that has been growing in TFT for a long time now, where playing flexible isn't necessarily about playing around what you hit, but it's about avoiding the bad units or traits. But once again, this just boils down to balancing, although in some cases, units or traits may just need to be reworked entirely. Hero augments can be completely fine in the future, but at a much smaller scale.
Let's see here. For future sets, do you think you could ever see hero augments as individual augments that slot into silver, gold, prismatic? Yes. Yes. I think the idea, like, for example, let's say Nasus was in set 9 and stacks on stacks existed as a separate augment. I think that's totally fine and a good thing. I don't think we need to necessarily have specific hero augments.
As Mort said, stacks on stacks returning a silver, gold, or a prismatic augment would be absolutely fine amongst the many other augments and mechanics in a set. But even if every hero augment was perfectly balanced, players should have still been told when the hero augment selection is, so they could have planned around it. And overall, it does seem like the devs bit off more than they could chew with hero augments, but this isn't their fault considering how rushed hero augments were. They barely had any time to consider all the possibilities after completely shifting the direction of the set's mechanic.
Yeah, we had those invasions that were kind of harder PvE fights. They also had boss items that were unique items tied to the specific boss, so a bunch of new items to balance was also pretty insane. At this point, we didn't even have hero augments yet, if I recall correctly, because, you know, we're working on invasions. And so what this means is, just like you just heard with Dragonlance, this is another example where, like, we're 3 months out, we still don't have the mechanic finalized? And I don't even remember how hero augments came exactly. I don't want to... But the point is, at some point we said we need to make hero augments, and then we had to make 118 of them, so we went.
Yeah, we had a lot of people end up kind of contributing to set 8 in different ways, but it was good. It was a lot of like, hey, here's newer people that can kind of take on these bite-sized projects of, you know, this slice of hero augments, or maybe like polishing this like champion that, you know, they maybe didn't work on the set from the beginning, but kind of get to do the final parts. So yeah.
And with so many devs contributing to hero augments, I believe there were just too many cooks in the kitchen, which resulted in quite a lot of unequal power distribution amongst hero augments. But I don't think this will be a problem in the future, as sets 10 onwards will have their own dedicated team and at least 12 months in development. But yeah, that is my final video on set 8 over. Whilst I do think hero augments were clearly a mistake, I definitely had my fun with this set, and I will look back fondly to some moments I've captured. But now I'll leave the question with you guys. How do you feel about hero augments? Were they a good mechanic or were they really bad? And will you miss them or are you glad they'll be gone? Let me know in the comments and remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me. And as always, thank you for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.